Rain hammered the cobblestones outside Ashcombe Manor as Duke Alistair Hawthorne stepped into the cold night air, eager to leave behind a gathering that had drained him of patience. He pulled his coat tighter and walked toward his waiting carriage, his mind already on the quiet of his own home. The driver, Edmund, held the door open, and Alistair climbed inside without a second thought. He settled into his seat, closed his eyes for a brief moment of relief, and reached down to place his gloves on the empty space beside him. That was when he felt it. A slight movement beneath the seat across from him. He froze, listening. The carriage creaked as the wheels began to turn, and in the dim light of the small lantern hanging inside, he saw a gloved hand press against the floorboard, followed by a face he did not recognize. A young woman, her hair damp and her eyes wide with fear, was crouched beneath the opposite seat, trying to make herself as small as possible. Alistair's hand moved instinctively toward the small cane resting beside him, ready to defend himself if needed. But before he could speak, the woman lifted a trembling hand toward him, silently begging him not to call out. Her lips parted, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she said the words that would change the course of his night, and perhaps his life. "Please," she said, "pretend I am your wife. Just until we are away from here. I will explain everything, I promise you. Just drive on." Alistair stared at her, stunned into silence. The carriage rattled forward, the horses picking up speed, as Edmund, unaware of what had just happened inside, guided them down the manor's long drive. Alistair could have called out immediately. He could have stopped the carriage and handed her over to the guards standing near the gate. Instead, something about the raw terror in her eyes made him hesitate. "Who are you?" he asked quietly, keeping his voice low so it would not carry outside the carriage walls. "There is no time," she said, glancing nervously toward the small window. "If they see me, they will take me back. Please, Your Grace. I only need until we pass the checkpoint at the end of the road." Alistair's jaw tightened. He was a man who valued order, who followed rules, and expected others to do the same. Yet the desperation in this stranger's voice was not something he could ignore. He noticed her hands were shaking, not from cold alone, but from something deeper, fear that had settled into her bones. "Sit up," he said finally. "If someone stops us and sees you hiding like a criminal, it will only draw more attention. Sit beside me and stay calm." She hesitated only a moment before pulling herself up from the floor and settling onto the seat across from him, straightening her damp cloak as best she could. Up close, he could see she was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with a delicate face marked by exhaustion. Her dress, though modest, was finely made, suggesting she was not a woman of the streets, but someone from a household of standing. The carriage rounded a bend, and through the window, Alistair spotted torches ahead. Several men stood near the checkpoint at the end of the manor's private road, lanterns raised, scanning each passing carriage. His stomach tightened. Whoever this woman was running from, they were serious enough to post watchmen along a private route at this hour. "Say nothing," Alistair murmured. "Let me handle this." The woman nodded, folding her hands in her lap, though her knuckles were pale from how tightly she pressed them together. As the carriage slowed, one of the men approached the window, his lantern casting flickering light across his face. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in a manner that suggested he served someone with wealth and influence, not a common constable. "Evening, Your Grace," the man said, recognizing Alistair immediately. Dukes were not difficult to identify, especially ones as well known as Alistair Hawthorne. "Forgive the delay. We are searching for a young woman who fled from a nearby estate earlier this evening. Have you seen anyone matching such a description along the road?" Alistair kept his expression calm, the same practiced composure he used in matters of state and business. "I have seen no one," he said evenly. "My wife and I were simply leaving the gathering at Ashcombe Manor. We have been together the entire evening." The man's eyes flicked toward the woman seated across from Alistair. She kept her gaze lowered, playing the part with a stillness that surprised him. For a moment, Alistair worried the man would ask further questions, perhaps request her name, or examine her more closely. Instead, the watchman merely nodded, apparently satisfied by the presence of a duke's authority. "Apologies for the inconvenience, Your Grace," the man said, stepping back and waving the carriage forward. "Safe travels to you and your lady wife." The carriage rolled past the checkpoint, and only once the torches had faded into the darkness behind them did the woman finally exhale. her shoulders sagging with relief. Alistair watched her carefully, noting how her hands trembled even now that the danger had passed. "You may explain yourself now," he said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "Who are you, and why are men searching the countryside for you at this hour?" She lifted her eyes to meet his, and for the first time, he saw not just fear in her expression, but something else. A quiet, stubborn determination that told him she was not simply a frightened girl running from imagined dangers. "My name is Eleanor," she said softly. "Eleanor Vance. I do not expect you to understand everything tonight, Your Grace. I only ask that you allow me to reach somewhere safe. After that, I will trouble you no further." "That is not an answer," Alistair replied. "You have placed me in a rather delicate position, Miss Vance. I have just lied to armed men on your behalf. I believe I am owed more than a name." Eleanor glanced out the window, watching the dark countryside pass by, before turning back to him with a resigned expression. "There is a man," she said carefully, "who believes he has a claim over my future. My family owes him a great debt, and he intends to collect it through marriage, whether I consent or not. Tonight, I was meant to sign papers binding me to him. I could not do it, so I ran." Alistair studied her, searching her face for any sign of deception. He had heard of arranged unions before, of families using their daughters to settle financial troubles. It was not uncommon among the aristocracy, however distasteful he found the practice. Still, something about the fear in her eyes suggested there was more to her story than she was willing to share so soon. "And this man," Alistair said, "he sent those watchmen after you?" Eleanor nodded. "He does not take rejection well. I fear what he might do if he finds me before I reach somewhere he cannot follow." The carriage continued through the quiet countryside, the rhythmic sound of hooves against the wet road filling the silence between them. Alistair considered his options carefully. He could stop at the next town and leave her with local authorities, washing his hands of the entire situation. It would be the simplest choice, the one least likely to entangle him in scandal or danger. Yet as he looked at Eleanor, sitting stiffly across from him, with her chin held high despite her evident exhaustion, he found himself unable to consider abandoning her so easily. There was something in her bearing, a quiet strength beneath the fear, that reminded him of qualities he respected deeply. "Where were you hoping to go?" he asked finally. "Anywhere," Eleanor admitted. "I had not thought that far ahead. I only knew I could not stay another moment in that house." Alistair sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "There is an inn a few miles from here, along the northern road. It is modest, but it is far enough from Ashcombe Manor that word is unlikely to travel quickly. We can stop there for the night, and in the morning, we will determine a proper course of action." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. "You would help me? You do not even know me. I know that a man threatened enough force to send armed watchmen after a woman who refused an arranged union," Alistair said, his voice hardening slightly. "That alone tells me enough about his character. Whatever your full story may be, Miss Vance, I do not intend to hand you over to someone capable of such behavior." Relief washed over Eleanor's face, though it was tempered by caution. She had learned, it seemed, not to trust kindness too quickly. "Thank you, Your Grace. I will not forget this." The carriage rolled onward through the night, the storm gradually easing into a gentle drizzle. Alistair found himself watching Eleanor more than he intended, curious about the young woman who had crawled beneath his carriage seat and altered the course of his evening entirely. She kept her gaze fixed on the passing darkness outside, lost in thoughts she clearly did not wish to share further. When they finally arrived at the small inn, its windows glowing warmly against the night, Alistair stepped out first, offering his hand to help Eleanor down. She hesitated only briefly before accepting it, her fingers cold against his palm. Together, they walked toward the entrance, maintaining the appearance of a weary traveling couple seeking shelter from the storm. The innkeeper, a stout man with a friendly face, greeted them without suspicion, assuming exactly what Alistair had hoped he would. "Rough night to be traveling," the man said, leading them toward the registration desk. "You are fortunate to have found shelter. Room for the two of you, then." Alistair glanced at Eleanor, who gave the faintest nod, understanding the necessity of maintaining their disguise. "Yes," Alistair said. "A room for my wife and myself." As the innkeeper prepared the paperwork, Eleanor stood close beside Alistair, playing her part with practiced calm, despite the exhaustion evident in her posture. It struck Alistair, watching her, that whatever life she had left behind had trained her well in the art of composure under pressure. It was not a skill easily learned, nor one earned through comfort and ease. Once the innkeeper handed over the room key and disappeared toward the back of the establishment, Eleanor's shoulders relaxed slightly, the performance dropping away now that they were alone in the dim hallway. "I am sorry to involve you in this deception," she said quietly, as they climbed the narrow staircase. "It was not my intention when the evening began." "I imagine your evening did not go as planned in several ways," Alistair replied, a faint hint of dry humor in his tone that seemed to ease some of the tension between them. Eleanor allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first he had seen from her since their strange meeting began. "No," she admitted, "it certainly did not." They reached the room, and Alistair opened the door, allowing Eleanor to enter first. The space was simple but clean, a single bed positioned near a modest fireplace, a wooden chair tucked into the corner. Eleanor's smile faded slightly as she took in the arrangement, clearly aware of the complications a shared room presented. "I will take the chair," Alistair said quickly, noticing her discomfort. "You should rest. It has been a difficult night for you." Eleanor looked at him with quiet gratitude, though a flicker of surprise crossed her features, as though she had not expected such consideration from a stranger, let alone one of his standing. "You do not have to trouble yourself further on my account, Your Grace." "Alistair," he said simply, "if we are to continue this charade, at least in private, you may drop the formalities." She nodded, settling onto the edge of the bed, her damp cloak finally removed and draped over the chair to dry. "Then you may call me Eleanor," she said softly. "Though I confess, I do not know how to properly thank you for what you have done tonight." Alistair took his place in the wooden chair, stretching his legs out as best he could in the confined space. "You may thank me by explaining, when you are ready, exactly what kind of danger I have placed myself in by helping you." Eleanor's expression grew serious once more, the brief moment of lightness fading. "His name is Lord Reginald Ashby," she said quietly. "My father owed him a considerable sum, borrowed years ago to save our family estate from ruin. When my father passed away last winter, Ashby came forward, claiming the debt could be settled only through my marriage to him. My mother, desperate and grieving, agreed on my behalf before I even understood what was happening." Alistair listened carefully, his expression darkening with each detail. He had heard the name Ashby before, in passing conversations among his peers, though never anything that suggested the depth of cruelty Eleanor now described. And tonight was meant to finalize this arrangement? Eleanor nodded. The papers were prepared. He intended for the signing to take place quietly, away from prying eyes, likely because he suspected I would resist if given the opportunity to speak publicly. I managed to slip away during a moment of confusion, when the household staff were occupied elsewhere. I did not have a plan beyond simply running as far and as fast as I could. "And you found my carriage," Alistair said. "I found the nearest carriage leaving the grounds," Eleanor corrected gently. "I did not know it belonged to a duke until it was already too late to reconsider my choice." Despite the seriousness of the conversation, Alistair found himself almost smiling at her honesty. There was no flattery in her words, no attempt to make her intrusion sound more calculated or clever than it truly was. She had simply been desperate, and fate had placed her in his path. "We will need a plan," Alistair said, his tone shifting into the practical, measured manner he used when addressing matters of business. "Ashby will not stop searching easily, especially if he believes his claim over you carries legal weight. We must determine whether such an agreement, signed under these circumstances, holds any true standing." Eleanor's brow furrowed with cautious hope. "You believe there may be a way to challenge it?" "I believe," Alistair said carefully, "that a debt owed by your father does not automatically transfer to obligate you personally, particularly if you never consented to the arrangement yourself. But these matters can be complicated, especially when a man of Ashby's influence is involved. We will need proper counsel and time to investigate the full nature of this debt." For the first time since he had discovered her hiding beneath his carriage seat, Eleanor looked at him with something beyond fear or desperation. Trust was beginning to form, fragile and uncertain, but present nonetheless. "Why would you go to such lengths for a stranger?" she asked quietly. Alistair considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. Perhaps because I have spent much of my life watching those with power take advantage of those without it, and saying nothing, because it was not my concern. Tonight, it became my concern the moment you asked me to pretend you were my wife. Eleanor lowered her eyes, moved by his words in a way she had not expected to be. The night had begun as her darkest hour, fleeing a fate she could not accept, hiding beneath the seat of a stranger's carriage, with nothing but fear guiding her actions. Yet somehow, through circumstances neither of them could have predicted, she had found an unlikely ally in a man whose title alone commanded respect and protection. Outside, the rain continued its gentle patter against the window, a soft and steady rhythm that gradually eased the tension in the room. Alistair watched Eleanor settle further into the modest bed, exhaustion finally overtaking the adrenaline that had carried her through the harrowing escape. Whatever challenges awaited them in the coming days, this night at least offered a temporary refuge, a pause before the storm that Alistair suspected was only beginning to gather on the horizon. As sleep began to claim Eleanor, her breathing slowing into a steady rhythm, Alistair remained awake in the wooden chair, his mind turning over the details of her story. Lord Reginald Ashby was not a man known for accepting defeat gracefully, and Alistair understood, even in these early hours, that helping Eleanor would likely draw him into a conflict far more dangerous than a single night's deception in a rain-soaked carriage. Yet as he watched her sleep, finally free from the immediate terror that had gripped her only hours before, he found he had no regrets about the choice he had made when her trembling hand first reached toward him in the darkness. The night stretched on, quiet and uncertain, carrying within it the first threads of a story neither of them could yet imagine reaching its end. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the inn-room, waking Eleanor from a sleep deeper than she had expected given the circumstances. For a moment, she forgot where she was, her mind still clouded by the terror of the previous night. Then she saw Alistair, seated in the same wooden chair, his eyes open and alert despite having likely slept very little. "You did not rest," Eleanor said, sitting up and pushing her hair away from her face. "I rested enough," Alistair replied, though the faint shadows beneath his eyes suggested otherwise. "We should discuss our next steps before the household begins to stir downstairs." Eleanor nodded, gathering her thoughts as she smoothed the wrinkles from her dress. The clarity of daylight brought with it a fresh wave of anxiety. In the darkness of the previous night, fleeing had felt like the only possible action. Now, in the quiet stillness of morning, the full weight of what she had done settled heavily upon her shoulders. She had run from her family home, defied a man of considerable power, and dragged an innocent duke into her troubles. "I have been thinking," Alistair said, breaking the silence, "that we cannot simply hide indefinitely. Ashby will continue searching, and the longer this continues, the more difficult it becomes to resolve cleanly. I believe our best course is to seek proper legal counsel regarding the nature of your father's debt." "You mentioned this last night," Eleanor said. "Do you truly believe there is a way to break this arrangement?" "I believe it is worth investigating thoroughly," Alistair said carefully. "Debts inherited through family circumstances are complicated matters, particularly when they involve coercion rather than voluntary agreement. If Ashby forced your mother's hand through threats or manipulation, there may be grounds to challenge the entire arrangement." Eleanor considered this, a flicker of hope rising within her chest, though she remained cautious. She had learned, through painful experience, that hope could be a dangerous thing when placed in the wrong circumstances. "And if there is no way to break it?" Alistair's expression grew solemn. "Then we will find another solution. I do not intend to see you forced into a life you did not choose, Eleanor. Whatever it takes to prevent that, I am willing to pursue." His words carried a conviction that surprised even him as he spoke them. Only hours earlier, Eleanor Vance had been a complete stranger, an unexpected intrusion into his carefully ordered life. Yet something about her situation, the injustice of it, had stirred within him a determination he had not felt in a long while. They descended the narrow staircase together, maintaining their disguise as a traveling couple for the benefit of the innkeeper and the few other guests already gathered for breakfast. Eleanor played her part convincingly, though Alistair noticed the way her eyes darted toward the windows each time the front door opened, betraying the fear she worked so hard to conceal. As they took their seats at a small table near the back of the dining room, A group of men entered the inn, their boots heavy against the wooden floor. Eleanor's hand tightened around her teacup, her knuckles whitening, as she recognized the uniform markings on their coats. These were not the same watchmen from the checkpoint the previous night, but their purpose was unmistakable. "Stay calm," Alistair murmured, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Look at me, not at them." Eleanor forced her gaze to meet his, though her breathing remained shallow with anxiety. The men moved through the dining room, speaking briefly with the innkeeper, before beginning to question the other guests. Alistair reached across the table, taking Eleanor's hand in his own, playing the role of a concerned husband, comforting his wife, though the gesture also served to steady her visibly trembling fingers. "Pardon the intrusion," one of the men said, approaching their table after finishing with the others nearby. "We are searching for a young woman, dark-haired, traveling alone. Have you seen anyone matching this description since arriving here?" Alistair looked up at the man with practiced calm, the same authoritative composure he had used the previous night. "My wife and I arrived quite late, seeking shelter from the storm. We have seen no one traveling alone, I am afraid." The man's eyes flicked briefly toward Eleanor, who kept her gaze lowered, playing the part of a demure wife, uninterested in the conversation happening around her. After a moment of scrutiny, the man nodded, apparently satisfied, and moved on to question the innkeeper further about any unregistered guests. Once the men had finally departed, continuing their search elsewhere, Eleanor exhaled slowly, releasing a breath she had not realized she was holding. "They are getting closer," she whispered. "Ashby will not stop until he finds me." "Then we must move quickly," Alistair said, his mind already working through their options. "I have a property some distance from here, quieter, and less likely to draw attention. We can arrange for you to stay there, while I make inquiries regarding your father's debt and Ashby's legal standing." Eleanor looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and hesitation. "You continue to offer more help than I have any right to expect." "Perhaps," Alistair said, "but I find myself unable to simply walk away from this situation, knowing what I now know. Come, we should leave before those men return." They departed the inn shortly after, once again disguised as a traveling couple, climbing into Alistair's carriage as Edmund guided the horses onto the northern road leading toward the countryside estate Alistair had mentioned. The journey passed largely in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts regarding the challenges that lay ahead. As the carriage traveled further from the searching watchman, Eleanor finally allowed herself to relax slightly, watching the passing scenery with cautious relief. Rolling hills stretched toward the horizon, dotted with grazing sheep and the occasional farmhouse, a stark contrast to the tension of their recent encounters. "Tell me about your father," Alistair said after a long stretch of silence, curious to understand more about the circumstances that had led Eleanor to this point. Eleanor's expression softened with a mixture of fondness and sorrow. He was a kind man, though not always practical with matters of finance. He believed in helping others, sometimes to his own detriment. "The debt to Ashby began years ago, when my father sought funds to support a struggling tenant community on our estate. He never anticipated it would grow into something that would threaten our entire family. And your mother agreed to this arrangement out of desperation?" "She was grieving," Eleanor said quietly. "My father's passing left her vulnerable, and Ashby exploited that vulnerability skillfully. He presented the marriage as a solution, a way to settle the debt while ensuring our family retained some measure of security. My mother, in her grief, did not fully consider what such an arrangement would mean for me." Alistair listened carefully, piecing together the full picture of the circumstances that had led Eleanor to hide beneath his carriage seat. The more he learned, the more his resolve strengthened to help her find a way out of this situation, regardless of the complications it might bring into his own life. "Does your mother know you have fled?" he asked. Eleanor's face grew troubled. "I left a note, explaining that I could not go through with the marriage. I do not know how she will react, whether she will be angry or relieved. Our relationship has been strained since my father's passing, colored by grief and desperation on both our parts. Perhaps, once this matter is resolved, there will be an opportunity to repair that relationship," Alistair offered gently. Eleanor gave a small, uncertain smile. "Perhaps, though I fear my mother may not easily forgive what she sees as a betrayal of the arrangement she made to protect our family." The carriage continued its journey through the countryside, eventually turning onto a private road lined with tall trees that led toward a modest but elegant manor house nestled among rolling hills. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly at the sight, taking in the peaceful beauty of the property that would serve as her temporary refuge. "This is Willowmere," Alistair explained as the carriage came to a stop before the entrance. "It belonged to my mother before her passing. I do not use it often, which makes it an ideal place for you to remain unnoticed while we address the matter of Ashby's claims." As they stepped down from the carriage, an older woman emerged from the manor house, her expression shifting from surprise to curiosity as she took in the sight of her employer, arriving with an unfamiliar young woman. This was Margaret, the housekeeper who maintained Willowmere in Alistair's frequent absence. "Your Grace," Margaret said, offering a respectful curtsy. "We were not expecting your arrival." "Margaret, this is Miss Eleanor Vance," Alistair said carefully, choosing his words to convey the seriousness of the situation without revealing more than necessary. "She will be staying here for a time, under circumstances that require discretion. I trust you to ensure her comfort and safety." Margaret's eyes flickered with understanding, sensing the gravity behind Alistair's careful phrasing. Years of service within noble households had taught her the value of discretion, and she nodded without further question. "Of course, Your Grace. I will prepare a room immediately." As Margaret led Eleanor toward the manor house, Alistair remained by the carriage for a moment, watching her retreating figure with a contemplative expression. The events of the past day had unfolded with a speed and intensity he had not anticipated when he stepped into his carriage the previous evening. Yet as he considered the path forward, he found himself surprisingly resolute in his commitment to seeing this situation through to a just resolution. He turned to Edmund, who had remained silent throughout the journey, his loyalty ensuring he would not question his employer's unusual decisions. "Edmund, I will need you to travel to London this afternoon. Seek out Nathaniel Gray, the solicitor who handles matters of estate and inheritance law. Tell him the situation is urgent and requires his immediate attention." Edmund nodded, understanding the seriousness in his employer's tone. "At once, Your Grace." As Edmund departed to prepare for his journey, Alistair entered Willowmere, finding Eleanor already settled into a comfortable sitting room near the back of the house. A cup of tea Margaret had prepared resting untouched on the table before her. She looked up as he entered, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and cautious relief. "This place is beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you for bringing me here." "You are safe for now," Alistair said, taking a seat across from her. "I have sent for a solicitor who specializes in matters of inheritance and debt. He should arrive within the next day, and we can begin properly investigating the legitimacy of Ashby's claims." Eleanor nodded, though the weight of uncertainty still lingered in her eyes. "And if Ashby discovers where I am hiding before we can resolve this?" "Willowmere is not widely known as one of my properties," Alistair assured her. "It was my mother's estate, kept quietly separate from my primary residences. It should provide sufficient protection while we address this matter properly." Despite his reassurances, Eleanor could not fully shake the anxiety that had gripped her since fleeing her family home. She understood the danger Ashby posed, not just to her future, but potentially to anyone who dared to help her against his wishes. "I worry for your safety as well, Alistair. A man like Ashby will not take kindly to discovering you have interfered with his plans." Alistair's expression grew serious, acknowledging the validity of her concern. "I am not without my own influence and resources, Eleanor. Ashby may hold considerable power within certain circles, but he does not hold power over everyone. I do not intend to let fear dictate my actions, particularly when I believe strongly in the injustice of what you have been forced to endure." His words offered Eleanor a measure of comfort, though the underlying danger of their situation remained ever present in her mind. As the afternoon light filtered through the windows of Willowmere, casting warm golden hues across the sitting room, she found herself studying the man who had so unexpectedly become her protector. There was a quiet strength to Alistair Hawthorne, tempered by genuine compassion, that seemed at odds with the reputation dukes often carried within society. He had not hesitated to shelter her, despite the risks involved, and had shown a willingness to challenge injustice that few men of his standing would risk their reputation to pursue. "Why do you care so deeply about my situation?" Eleanor asked again, unable to fully understand his motivations, despite his earlier explanation. Alistair considered the question thoughtfully before responding. Perhaps because I have spent much of my adult life observing the ways power can be misused against those with fewer resources to defend themselves. My own father, before his passing, taught me the importance of using influence responsibly, to protect rather than exploit. I suppose, in helping you, I am honoring that lesson in a way I have not had the opportunity to do before. Eleanor's expression softened at his words, a genuine warmth beginning to form between them, despite the extraordinary circumstances of their meeting. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. He was, Alistair agreed, a faint smile touching his lips, though I confess, even he might find our current situation somewhat unconventional. The lightness of his tone eased some of the tension in the room, drawing a small laugh from Eleanor, despite the seriousness of their circumstances. It was the first genuine laugh she had allowed herself since fleeing her family home, and it seemed to surprise her as much as it pleased Alistair to witness it. As evening approached, Margaret prepared a modest meal for the two of them, and they dined together in the quiet sitting room, discussing lighter topics as a temporary respite from the weight of their circumstances. Eleanor spoke of her childhood memories at her family's estate, of quiet afternoons spent in the gardens with her father before his health began to decline. Alistair shared stories of his own upbringing, of the responsibilities that came with his title from a young age, and the loneliness that often accompanied such expectations. Through their conversation, a genuine connection began to form, built not on the desperation of their initial meeting, but on a growing mutual respect and understanding. Eleanor found herself grateful, not just for Alistair's protection, but for the unexpected kindness and companionship he offered during what remained one of the most frightening periods of her life. As night fell over Willowmere, Alistair prepared to depart for his primary residence, promising to return the following day, once word arrived from his solicitor in London. Standing at the entrance of the manor house, he turned to Eleanor, who had accompanied him to see him off. "You will be safe here," he assured her. "Margaret will see to your needs, and I will return as soon as there is news to share." Eleanor nodded, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed her features at the thought of him leaving. "Thank you, Alistair, for everything you have done." "We have only just begun," Alistair replied gently, "but I do not intend to abandon this cause until we have secured your freedom properly." As his carriage departed into the darkening evening, Eleanor watched from the entrance of Willowmere, a complex mixture of emotions swirling within her. Fear for what remained uncertain, gratitude for the unexpected ally she had found, and something else she could not quite name, a warmth that had begun to take root despite the danger that continued to loom over her future. The night settled quietly over the countryside, carrying with it the promise of challenges yet to come, but also, for the first time since her father's passing, a fragile sense of hope that her circumstances might yet find a resolution she could accept. 2 days passed at Willowmere, in relative calm, though the quiet did little to ease the tension building within Alistair as he awaited word from his solicitor. Nathaniel Gray had proven reliable in the past, handling delicate matters of inheritance for several noble families with discretion and skill. But the complexity of Eleanor's situation demanded thorough investigation that could not be rushed without risking oversight. Eleanor spent her days at Willowmere adjusting to the strange rhythm of hiding while trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Margaret proved a comforting presence, sharing stories of the estate's history while ensuring Eleanor wanted for nothing during her stay. Yet beneath the surface, calm, anxiety continued to gnaw at her, the knowledge that Ashby's men remained actively searching, never far from her thoughts. On the third morning, Alistair returned to Willowmere earlier than expected, his expression carrying a seriousness that immediately alerted Eleanor to significant developments. She met him in the entrance hall, searching his face for any indication of what news he brought. "Nathaniel has completed his initial investigation," Alistair said, leading her toward the sitting room where they could speak privately. "The findings are troubling, though perhaps not entirely surprising, given what you have already shared about Ashby's character." Eleanor took a seat, bracing herself for whatever revelations awaited. "Tell me everything." Alistair settled across from her, pulling several documents from a leather satchel he had carried into the room. "The debt your father owed to Ashby was indeed legitimate, borrowed to support the tenant community, as you described. However, Nathaniel discovered something concerning in the terms of the original agreement. The interest rates applied to the debt were far higher than standard practice, structured in a way that made repayment nearly impossible within a reasonable time frame. "You mean Ashby intended for the debt to grow beyond what my father could ever repay?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "That appears to be the case," Alistair confirmed. "Furthermore, Nathaniel found records suggesting Ashby has employed similar tactics with several other families over the years, using seemingly generous loans as a means of gaining leverage over vulnerable estates. Your family is not the first to find themselves trapped by his manipulative practices." Eleanor's hands clenched in her lap, fury replacing the fear that had dominated her emotions since fleeing her home. "He deliberately engineered our ruin, all so he could later claim me as payment." "It certainly appears that way," Alistair said grimly. "Nathaniel believes there may be grounds to challenge the entire debt as predatory and unlawful, particularly given the circumstances under which the marriage arrangement was proposed following your father's passing. However, proving this in a formal legal setting will require careful preparation and likely the testimony of others who have suffered similarly under Ashby's schemes. Would such families be willing to come forward?" Eleanor asked, uncertain whether victims of similar circumstances would risk exposing themselves to Ashby's retaliation. "That remains to be seen," Alistair admitted. "Nathaniel has identified at least 2 other families who may have experienced comparable treatment. He intends to approach them discreetly, though we must proceed carefully to avoid alerting Ashby to our investigation before we have gathered sufficient evidence." Eleanor absorbed this information slowly, the pieces of Ashby's cruelty forming a clearer, more disturbing picture than she had initially understood. "This goes far beyond my own situation," she said quietly. "How many other families has he harmed through these same tactics?" "I do not yet know the full extent," Alistair said, "but I intend to find out. A man capable of such calculated cruelty should not be permitted to continue operating without consequence." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching the sitting room. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression tight with concern. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but there is a rider approaching the property. He bears Ashby's colors." Alistair rose immediately, his posture shifting into alert readiness. "How far?" "Perhaps a quarter mile," Margaret replied. "He is traveling alone, though I cannot say whether others follow behind him." Eleanor's face paled at the news, her earlier anger giving way once more to fear. "He has found me." "We do not know that for certain," Alistair said, though his own concern was evident despite his attempt at reassurance. "It may simply be a coincidence, or perhaps Ashby is searching the surrounding properties without specific knowledge of your presence here. Margaret, please take Eleanor to the upper floor and ensure she remains out of sight." Margaret nodded, quickly ushering Eleanor from the sitting room and up the narrow staircase toward the private quarters. Eleanor's heart pounded as they moved, every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet sending fresh waves of anxiety through her body. Margaret guided her into a small room at the end of the corridor, gesturing toward a wardrobe positioned near the window. "Stay hidden until His Grace sends word that it is safe," Margaret instructed quietly. "I will remain nearby to assist if needed." Eleanor nodded, her breathing shallow, as she settled into the confined space of the wardrobe, listening intently for any sound that might indicate what was transpiring downstairs. Through the thin walls, she could faintly hear the sound of a horse approaching the manor, followed by muffled voices exchanging what she assumed were formal greetings. Below, Alistair stood at the entrance of Willowmere, watching as the rider dismounted, revealing a man he recognized as one of Ashby's personal attendants, though not one he had encountered directly before. The man approached with a measured, deliberate pace, his expression carefully neutral despite the obvious purpose of his visit. "Your Grace," the man said, offering a slight bow. "Forgive the intrusion. Lord Ashby extends his greetings, and wonders whether you might have information regarding a young woman who recently went missing from his household. Given your standing among the nobility, he thought perhaps word of her whereabouts might have reached you through various social circles." Alistair maintained his composed exterior, though internally, he calculated carefully how to respond without arousing suspicion.
"I am afraid I have heard nothing of such matters."
"My time has been largely occupied with estate affairs these past few days. What is the nature of Lord Ashby's connection to this missing woman?" "She was betrothed to Lord Ashby," the man explained, "though it seems she fled rather suddenly, without proper explanation. He is understandably concerned for her well-being, given the dangers a young woman alone might encounter while traveling unprotected. The careful phrasing of the man's words did not escape Alistair's notice. Ashby was clearly attempting to frame the situation as one of concern rather than possession, likely anticipating that outright claims of ownership over Eleanor might raise uncomfortable questions among those he approached for assistance. A troubling situation indeed, Alistair replied smoothly. I will certainly keep an eye out. Should any information come to my attention, please extend my regards to Lord Ashby, and my hope that the young woman is found safely. The man studied Alistair for a moment longer than felt entirely comfortable, as though searching for any indication of deception in his response. Alistair held his gaze steadily, refusing to betray the tension building beneath his calm exterior. Thank you for your time, Your Grace, the man finally said, offering another slight bow before returning to his horse. Lord Ashby will be most appreciative of any assistance you might provide in this matter. Alistair watched as the man rode away from Willowmere, disappearing back down the private road, toward the main countryside route. Only once the rider had fully vanished from sight did Alistair allow himself to release the tension he had been holding throughout the exchange. He turned and made his way quickly back into the manor house, calling for Margaret to bring Eleanor down from her hiding place. When Eleanor emerged from the upper floor, her face still pale with residual fear, Alistair explained the details of the conversation that had just transpired. He does not yet know you are here, Alistair assured her, but Ashby is clearly making inquiries among the nobility, searching for any information regarding your whereabouts. We must be more cautious moving forward. He will not stop, Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly. Even if we prove the debt was predatory, he holds enough influence to make my life difficult for years to come. Which is precisely why we must gather sufficient evidence to expose his practices thoroughly, Alistair said firmly. A man's influence diminishes considerably once his true character becomes known to those whose opinion he values most. Eleanor considered his words, drawing strength from his unwavering resolve despite the mounting dangers surrounding their situation. What do you propose we do next? Nathaniel intends to reach out to the other families he has identified as possible victims of Ashby's schemes, Alistair explained. In the meantime, I believe it would be wise for you to remain here at Willowmere, though perhaps we should consider additional precautions, given how close Ashby's search has already come. What kind of precautions? Eleanor asked. Alistair considered the question carefully, weighing the various options available to them. I have another property, further removed from the areas Ashby is likely to search initially. It may be wise to relocate you there temporarily, at least until we have gathered sufficient evidence to move forward with challenging the debt formally. Eleanor nodded, understanding the necessity of continued caution, despite her growing weariness with hiding and uncertainty. Whatever you believe is safest, I trust your judgment in this matter. Her words carried a genuine trust that had developed steadily over the past days, a trust Alistair found himself determined to honor fully. He had entered this situation somewhat impulsively, driven by an instinctive sense of justice upon witnessing Eleanor's desperate flight from an unjust fate. Yet as the complexity of Ashby's schemes became increasingly apparent, Alistair recognized that this was no longer simply a matter of helping one woman escape an unwanted marriage. It had become a matter of exposing systemic cruelty that had likely harmed numerous families beyond Eleanor's own. As the day progressed, preparations began for Eleanor's relocation to Alistair's more secluded property, a modest cottage nestled within a forested region several hours further from the areas Ashby's search had thus far covered. Margaret helped Eleanor gather the few belongings she had managed to bring during her initial flight, while Alistair made arrangements to ensure their movements would not draw unwanted attention. That evening, as they prepared to depart Willowmere under the cover of darkness, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the remarkable turn her circumstances had taken since that desperate night in Alistair's carriage. What had begun as a frantic bid for survival had evolved into something far more significant, a fight not just for her own freedom, but potentially for justice on behalf of others who had suffered under Ashby's manipulative practices. Are you frightened? Alistair asked quietly as they climbed into the carriage, Edmund once again guiding the horses through the darkness toward their next destination. Eleanor considered the question honestly before responding. Yes, though perhaps less than I was that first night. Somehow, having an ally in this fight makes the fear more manageable. Alistair offered a small, reassuring smile. You are stronger than you realize, Eleanor. Few would have shown the courage to flee such circumstances, let alone maintain composure through everything that has followed. Eleanor met his gaze, gratitude, and something deeper reflected in her expression. I could not have managed any of this without your assistance. Whatever happens moving forward, I want you to know how truly grateful I am for the risks you have taken on my behalf. We are far from finished, Alistair reminded her gently, though his tone carried warmth alongside the seriousness of his words. But I believe, together, we will see this matter resolved justly. As the carriage carried them deeper into the countryside, away from the immediate dangers surrounding Willowmere, both Eleanor and Alistair understood that the path ahead remained fraught with uncertainty. Yet within that uncertainty, a partnership had formed, built upon mutual respect, shared purpose, and a growing bond that neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed on that rain-soaked night just days before. The forest surrounding their destination grew thicker as the carriage continued its journey, moonlight filtering through the canopy above, casting shifting patterns across the road ahead. Whatever challenges awaited them at this next stage of their journey, both Eleanor and Alistair carried with them a renewed sense of determination, fortified by the growing understanding that this fight extended far beyond personal survival into something far more meaningful. The cottage Alistair had chosen for Eleanor's continued refuge sat quietly within a dense forest, far removed from the main roads that connected the surrounding estates. It was smaller than Willowmere, modest in its furnishings, yet it offered a sense of seclusion that felt reassuring, given the mounting dangers they now faced. Eleanor settled into her new surroundings cautiously, aware that even this hidden location might not remain secret indefinitely. Days passed with little word from Nathaniel regarding his investigation into the other families potentially harmed by Ashby's predatory practices. Alistair visited when he could, though his own responsibilities as Duke required careful management to avoid arousing suspicion regarding his frequent absences. During one such visit, he arrived with news that immediately captured Eleanor's full attention. Nathaniel has located a family willing to speak, Alistair said, settling into a chair across from Eleanor within the cottage's modest sitting area. The Whitfield family, residing several counties east of here. Their circumstances closely mirror your own, a debt owed to Ashby that grew impossibly large, followed by pressure to secure repayment through marriage. Did they agree to the arrangement? Eleanor asked, leaning forward with cautious hope. Their daughter did marry Ashby's associate, under circumstances similar to what was proposed for you, Alistair explained. However, the marriage ended tragically, and the family has harbored resentment toward Ashby ever since, believing he orchestrated the entire situation for his own benefit. Eleanor's expression darkened at this revelation. What happened to their daughter? Alistair hesitated, choosing his words carefully. She passed away under circumstances the family considers suspicious, though nothing was ever formally investigated at the time. They believe speaking now, in support of exposing Ashby's practices, might finally bring some measure of justice for what happened to her. The weight of this information settled heavily upon Eleanor, the full extent of Ashby's cruelty becoming increasingly clear with each new revelation. What she had initially believed to be simply a personal ordeal now appeared to be part of a much larger pattern of exploitation and harm that Ashby had inflicted upon multiple families over the years. We must help them find justice, Eleanor said firmly. Whatever risks this entails, exposing him properly matters more than my own safety alone. Alistair nodded, appreciating the strength of conviction Eleanor demonstrated despite everything she had already endured. Nathaniel intends to gather formal statements from the Whitfield family, alongside the documentation regarding your own father's debt. If we can establish a clear pattern of predatory lending, combined with coercive marriage arrangements, we may have sufficient grounds to bring this matter before proper authorities. And if Ashby learns of this investigation before we are prepared to act? Eleanor asked, the ever-present fear of discovery never far from her thoughts. We must move as quickly and quietly as possible, Alistair acknowledged. Nathaniel has been cautious in his inquiries, but a man like Ashby maintains extensive networks of information. It is only a matter of time before he suspects something is being investigated, if he has not already. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps outside the cottage, causing both of them to tense with immediate alertness. Alistair moved cautiously toward the window, peering out carefully to identify the source of the disturbance. Relief washed over his features as he recognized Edmund approaching, though the urgency in the driver's pace suggested important news. "Your Grace," Edmund said breathlessly, as Alistair opened the door to admit him. "Forgive the intrusion, but I bring word from Nathaniel. He insists the matter is urgent." Alistair accepted the sealed letter Edmund extended toward him, breaking the wax seal quickly to reveal Nathaniel's carefully penned message. As he read, his expression grew increasingly troubled, prompting Eleanor to rise from her seat with concern. "What does it say?" she asked. Alistair looked up, his jaw tightening with evident tension. "Ashby has become aware that someone is investigating his lending practices. Nathaniel believes his own inquiries may have been discovered, potentially compromising our efforts before we are fully prepared to act." Eleanor's face paled at this news. "Does he know it involves me specifically?" "Nathaniel does not believe so, not yet," Alistair replied. "But it is only a matter of time before Ashby connects the pieces, particularly if he learns of my involvement in sheltering you these past days." The gravity of their situation intensified with this revelation, the careful plans they had begun formulating now threatened by the very real possibility of Ashby's growing awareness. Eleanor felt the familiar grip of fear returning, though this time it was tempered by a fierce determination not to allow that fear to control her actions as it once had. "We cannot allow him to intimidate the Whitfield family into silence before they have the opportunity to speak formally," Eleanor said firmly. "If Ashby suspects an investigation is underway, he may attempt to silence anyone who might testify against him." Alistair nodded gravely, recognizing the validity of her concern. Nathaniel has already taken steps to ensure the Whitfield family's safety, arranging for them to relocate temporarily while the investigation proceeds. However, this development means we must move more quickly than initially planned. "What is our next step?" Eleanor asked, her voice steady, despite the mounting pressure of their circumstances. Alistair considered their options carefully, weighing the risks against the necessity of decisive action. "Nathaniel believes we should approach the matter through official channels sooner rather than later, presenting what evidence we have gathered thus far to the appropriate magistrate, even if our case remains incomplete. Delaying further risks, giving Ashby the opportunity to destroy evidence or intimidate witnesses into silence." Eleanor absorbed this information, understanding the significant risks involved in moving forward before their case was fully prepared. Yet she also recognized the greater danger in allowing Ashby additional time to consolidate his defenses against the accusations they intended to bring. "Then we must act," she said resolutely. "Whatever the outcome, I would rather face this challenge directly than continue living in fear of when Ashby might finally discover my location." Alistair studied her with evident admiration, recognizing the remarkable transformation that had occurred within Eleanor since that first desperate night in his carriage. The frightened young woman, hiding beneath his seat, had grown into someone determined to fight, not just for her own freedom, but for justice on behalf of others harmed by the same predatory cruelty. "I will arrange a meeting with the magistrate who oversees matters within this region," Alistair said. "Nathaniel will present the documentation we have gathered, alongside statements from the Whitfield family. Given the seriousness of the allegations, I believe we can request protective measures while the investigation proceeds further." As preparations began for this next crucial step in their fight against Ashby, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how dramatically her circumstances had shifted since fleeing her family home. What had begun as a desperate bid for personal survival had evolved into a broader campaign for justice, one that carried significant risks, but also the potential for meaningful change beyond her own individual freedom. That evening, as Alistair prepared to depart the cottage to begin arranging the necessary meetings with the magistrate, Eleanor found herself reluctant to see him leave, the growing bond between them now extending beyond mere circumstances of necessity into something she was only beginning to understand fully. "Be careful," she said softly, as he prepared to mount his horse for the journey back toward his primary residence. "Ashby has shown he is capable of considerable cruelty. I would not wish for you to become a target of his retaliation because of your involvement in helping me." Alistair paused, meeting her gaze with a warmth that had grown steadily throughout their time together. "I have made my choice in this matter, Eleanor, and I do not regret it. Whatever risks lie ahead, I remain committed to seeing this fight through to its proper conclusion." Eleanor watched as he rode away into the gathering darkness, her heart carrying a complex mixture of fear for what lay ahead and a growing appreciation for the man who had so unexpectedly become central to her fight for justice and freedom. The forest surrounding the cottage grew quiet once more, though within Eleanor, a renewed sense of purpose had taken root, strengthening her resolve to see this battle through, regardless of the challenges that remained before them. As night fully descended upon the countryside, Eleanor retreated into the cottage, her thoughts turning toward the uncertain days ahead. The path toward justice remained fraught with danger, yet for the first time since her father's passing, she felt genuinely hopeful that circumstances might yet turn in her favor, guided by the unexpected alliance that had formed from the chaos of that first desperate night. The following morning, Alistair traveled directly to the residence of Magistrate Arthur Bellamy, a man known throughout the region for his fairness and unwillingness to bend to pressure from the nobility, regardless of their standing. Nathaniel Gray met him there, carrying a thick folder of documentation that represented weeks of careful investigation into Ashby's predatory financial practices. Magistrate Bellamy received them in his private study, his expression measured and attentive, as Nathaniel began presenting the evidence they had gathered. The details of the original debt agreement between Eleanor's father and Ashby were laid out clearly, highlighting the deliberately excessive interest rates that had transformed a manageable loan into an insurmountable burden. "This pattern of lending appears deliberately structured to trap borrowers," Bellamy observed, examining the documents carefully. "You mentioned other families have experienced similar circumstances." "The Whitfield family," Nathaniel confirmed, presenting additional documentation. "Their daughter was married under comparable circumstances, and her subsequent passing remains, in the family's view, insufficiently investigated, given the suspicious nature of the timing." Bellamy's expression grew increasingly serious as he reviewed the full scope of evidence presented before him. "These are grave accusations, gentlemen. Lord Ashby holds considerable influence within certain circles. Pursuing formal charges against him will require substantial and irrefutable evidence to withstand the scrutiny such a case will inevitably face. We understand the challenges involved," Alistair said firmly. "However, we believe the pattern of behavior demonstrated here justifies a thorough formal investigation, regardless of Ashby's standing within society." Bellamy studied Alistair carefully, recognizing the determination behind his words. "Your involvement in this matter, Your Grace, carries its own risks. Ashby will not respond kindly to a duke actively working to expose his practices." "I am aware of the risks," Alistair replied evenly, "but I cannot in good conscience remain silent while a man continues exploiting vulnerable families for his own gain." After further discussion, Bellamy agreed to formally open an investigation into Ashby's lending practices, citing the substantial evidence presented as sufficient grounds for proceeding. He assured Alistair and Nathaniel that appropriate protective measures would be implemented for both Eleanor and the Whitfield family throughout the duration of the investigation. "This will not resolve quickly," Bellamy cautioned as their meeting concluded. "Matters of this nature, particularly involving individuals of Ashby's standing, require careful and thorough examination. I would advise continued caution regarding Miss Vance's location and safety while this process unfolds." Alistair thanked the magistrate for his willingness to pursue the matter fairly, despite the complications inherent in challenging a man of Ashby's influence. As he and Nathaniel departed the residence, a sense of cautious optimism settled over them, tempered by the understanding that the road ahead remained long and fraught with potential obstacles. "This is only the beginning," Nathaniel observed as they walked toward their waiting horses. "Ashby will fight this with everything at his disposal once he learns of the formal investigation. Then we must ensure our evidence remains solid enough to withstand whatever challenges he presents," Alistair replied, his resolve unwavering despite the daunting nature of the task before them. Meanwhile, at the secluded cottage, Eleanor spent the day in restless anticipation, uncertain how the meeting with the magistrate had unfolded. Margaret, who had been sent to assist Eleanor during Alistair's absence, did her best to keep her occupied with small tasks around the cottage, though nothing could fully distract Eleanor from the weight of uncertainty pressing upon her. As afternoon gave way to evening, the sound of an approaching horse finally drew Eleanor to the window, relief flooding through her as she recognized Alistair's familiar figure. She rushed to greet him as he dismounted, searching his expression for any indication of how the meeting had proceeded. "Tell me everything," she said, as they entered the cottage together. Alistair recounted the details of their meeting with Magistrate Bellamy, explaining the formal investigation that had now been opened into Ashby's practices. Eleanor listened intently, a complex mixture of relief and continued anxiety reflected in her expression as she absorbed the significance of this development. "This is real progress," she said finally, "though I imagine Ashby will not accept this quietly once he learns of the investigation." "No," Alistair agreed. "We must remain vigilant, particularly regarding your safety here. Bellamy has promised protective measures, but until those are fully in place, we cannot afford to grow complacent." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Margaret entering the room, her expression tense with concern. "Your Grace, forgive the interruption, but I believe someone has been observing the cottage from the tree line. I noticed movement while collecting water from the well earlier." Alistair's expression immediately hardened with alertness. "How long ago?" "Perhaps an hour," Margaret replied. "I did not wish to alarm Miss Vance unnecessarily, but given recent developments, I thought it best to inform you immediately." Eleanor's earlier relief gave way once more to fear, the reality of their precarious situation reasserting itself sharply. "Do you believe it was one of Ashby's men?" "I cannot say for certain," Alistair replied, though his tone carried evident concern. "But we cannot take unnecessary risks. I believe it would be wise to relocate you once more, at least until proper protective measures are fully established." The prospect of yet another relocation weighed heavily upon Eleanor, the constant uncertainty of hiding taking its toll on her emotional resilience. Yet she understood the necessity of continued caution, particularly given how close Ashby's search efforts had already come on more than one occasion. "Where would we go this time?" she asked, exhaustion evident in her voice. Alistair considered their options carefully, recognizing the limited number of properties available that offered sufficient distance from areas Ashby was likely to search. "I have a small residence near the coast, several hours from here. It is less commonly known among my properties, which should provide additional security while we await further developments from the investigation." Eleanor nodded, accepting the necessity of this continued disruption despite her growing weariness. "Very well. Whatever keeps us safe until this matter can be properly resolved." As preparations began for their departure toward the coastal residence, Eleanor found herself increasingly reliant on Alistair's steady presence throughout the chaos surrounding her situation. What had begun as a simple act of desperate deception in his carriage had evolved into a partnership built on mutual trust and a shared commitment to justice, one that continued to deepen with each new challenge they faced together. They departed the cottage under the cover of darkness once more, Edmund guiding the carriage carefully along less traveled routes to minimize the risk of detection during their journey toward the coast. Throughout the long ride, Eleanor found herself drawing comfort from Alistair's calm presence beside her, his steady resolve offering reassurance, even as the dangers surrounding their situation continued to mount. "Do you ever regret helping me that first night?" Eleanor asked quietly as the carriage traveled through the darkened countryside. Alistair considered the question thoughtfully before responding. "Not for a moment. Whatever challenges we continue to face, I believe firmly in the rightness of this fight. Ashby has caused harm to too many families for too long. If my involvement in exposing his practices helps bring an end to that harm, then I consider the risks well worth taking." Eleanor felt a surge of warmth at his unwavering conviction, gratitude mingling with an emotion she was only beginning to fully recognize within herself. The bond that had formed between them throughout this ordeal had grown into something far more significant than mere circumstances of necessity, evolving into a genuine connection built upon shared values and mutual respect. As the carriage continued its journey through the night, the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore gradually became audible, signaling their approach toward the coastal residence that would serve as Eleanor's next refuge. Whatever challenges awaited them in the coming days, both Eleanor and Alistair remained resolute in their determination to see this fight through to a just conclusion, regardless of the dangers that continued to shadow their path forward. The stars overhead offered a rare moment of peaceful beauty amid the ongoing turmoil of their circumstances, a brief reminder that even in the darkest of situations, hope remained a constant companion for those willing to fight for what they believed to be right. The coastal residence, a stone cottage perched near the edge of tall cliffs overlooking the sea, offered Eleanor a sense of tranquility she had not experienced since fleeing her family home. The rhythmic sound of waves breaking against the rocks below provided a soothing backdrop to the otherwise tumultuous circumstances of her life, and for the first time in weeks, she found herself sleeping through entire nights without waking in fear. Alistair remained at the coastal residence for several days, unable to justify frequent absences from his primary duties, without arousing suspicion among his peers. During this time, he and Eleanor settled into a comfortable rhythm, spending mornings walking along the cliffside paths and evenings discussing the ongoing investigation into Ashby's practices as updates arrived periodically from Nathaniel. Their conversations gradually expanded beyond matters of the investigation, touching upon deeper subjects that revealed more about who they each were as individuals. Eleanor learned of Alistair's early ambitions before inheriting his title, dreams of studying architecture that had been set aside once the responsibilities of his position became clear. Alistair, in turn, discovered Eleanor's passion for painting, a skill she had cultivated privately during the quiet years following her father's declining health. "You should return to it," Alistair suggested one evening as they sat together near the fireplace, the sound of waves audible through the cottage's thin walls. "Once this matter is resolved, there is no reason you cannot pursue whatever passions bring you fulfillment." Eleanor smiled softly at the suggestion, though uncertainty lingered beneath her expression. "I have not painted in years, not since my father's health began to fail. It felt frivolous to indulge in such pursuits while our family struggled with more pressing concerns. Perhaps it is time to reconsider that perspective," Alistair said gently. "You deserve a life beyond mere survival, Eleanor. Whatever happens with Ashby, I hope you find your way back to the things that bring you genuine joy." His words touched something deep within Eleanor, a reminder that her life held value beyond the immediate crisis consuming her days. She found herself studying Alistair with growing appreciation, recognizing the genuine care he demonstrated not just for her safety, but for her well-being and future happiness. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger bearing word from Nathaniel, urgency evident in the hurried manner of his approach to the cottage. Alistair rose immediately to receive the message, his expression shifting from calm contentment to focused concern as he read through the contents. "What does it say?" Eleanor asked, rising to join him. "The Whitfield family has agreed to provide formal testimony," Alistair explained, relief evident in his tone. "Additionally, Nathaniel has uncovered records suggesting at least 3 other families may have experienced similar predatory arrangements under Ashby's lending practices. The evidence against him continues to grow stronger." Eleanor felt a surge of hope at this news, the possibility of genuine justice becoming increasingly tangible with each new development. "Does this mean formal charges might soon be brought against him?" "Nathaniel believes we are approaching that point," Alistair confirmed, though he cautions that Ashby remains a formidable adversary, likely already preparing his own defense against whatever accusations we bring forward. As if summoned by the very mention of his name, another piece of correspondence arrived shortly after, this one bearing a seal Eleanor immediately recognized with a sinking feeling of dread. Alistair broke the seal carefully, his expression darkening as he read through Ashby's carefully worded message. "He knows," Alistair said grimly, passing the letter to Eleanor so she could read its contents herself. The letter, though carefully phrased to avoid direct accusations, made clear that Ashby had become fully aware of both the formal investigation into his practices and Alistair's involvement in sheltering Eleanor throughout the ordeal. Beneath the polite formalities of aristocratic correspondence lay an unmistakable threat, a warning that continued interference in his affairs would carry significant consequences. "He is threatening you directly now," Eleanor said, her voice tight with concern. "This is precisely what I feared when I first accepted your help. I have placed you in genuine danger." Alistair took the letter back, his jaw set with determined resolve, despite the evident threat contained within its careful phrasing. "I do not intimidate easily, Eleanor. Ashby's threats only confirm that our efforts are proving effective. A man does not resort to such tactics unless he feels his position genuinely threatened." Despite his reassurances, Eleanor could not fully shake the fear that their growing success in exposing Ashby's practices might come at a cost far greater than either of them had initially anticipated. "What do you believe he intends to do?" I do not know precisely, Alistair admitted, but we must exercise increased caution moving forward. I will need to strengthen the security measures here, and perhaps consider whether it remains wise for me to continue visiting as frequently as I have been. The suggestion of reduced visits struck Eleanor with unexpected disappointment, a feeling that surprised her given the practical necessity behind such caution. Over the weeks since their unusual first meeting, Alistair's presence had become a source of comfort and stability amid the chaos of her circumstances, and the thought of facing this uncertainty with less frequent support left her feeling unexpectedly vulnerable. I understand the necessity, she said, though her tone betrayed the reluctance she felt regarding this development. Your safety must remain a priority, particularly given how directly Ashby has now threatened you. Alistair noticed the hesitation in her voice, recognizing the depth of connection that had grown between them throughout their shared ordeal. I do not intend to abandon you, Eleanor, regardless of the risks involved. We will simply need to exercise greater discretion in how we continue our efforts moving forward. His reassurance offered some comfort, though the weight of Ashby's threat continued to loom over their conversation for the remainder of the evening. As night fell over the coastal residence, both Eleanor and Alistair found themselves contemplating the increasingly dangerous path their fight for justice had taken, understanding that Ashby's growing awareness of their efforts likely signaled more aggressive countermeasures in the days ahead. The following morning, Alistair departed the coastal residence with evident reluctance, promising to return as soon as circumstances allowed, while also arranging for additional security measures to protect Eleanor during his absence. Margaret remained behind to assist with daily tasks, while a trusted guard, recommended by Nathaniel for his discretion and reliability, was stationed nearby to ensure Eleanor's continued safety. As Eleanor watched Alistair's departure from the cottage window, she found herself reflecting on how profoundly her circumstances and her own understanding of herself had shifted since that desperate night in his carriage. What had begun as a simple act of survival had evolved into a complex fight for justice, entangled with a growing bond that neither she nor Alistair had anticipated when their paths first crossed. The days that followed brought a tense stillness to the coastal residence, each moment carrying an undercurrent of anxiety regarding what Ashby might attempt next, now that he was fully aware of the investigation threatening his carefully constructed schemes. Eleanor busied herself with small tasks, attempting to maintain a semblance of normalcy despite the persistent uncertainty surrounding her future. On the fourth day following Alistair's departure, a disturbance near the cliffside path drew the attention of the guard stationed to protect the cottage. Eleanor, alerted by Margaret to the commotion, watched anxiously from the window as the guard investigated what appeared to be signs of someone having recently traversed the normally undisturbed pathway leading toward the residence. It may simply be a local traveler, Margaret offered, though her tone carried evident concern despite the attempt at reassurance. Eleanor nodded, though she could not fully shake the anxiety building within her chest. The peaceful sanctuary the coastal residents had initially offered now felt increasingly precarious, the looming threat of Ashby's retaliation casting a shadow over what had briefly been a period of relative calm within her tumultuous circumstances. As evening approached, word arrived from Alistair, delivered by a rider who had traveled quickly from his primary residence. The message contained troubling news that confirmed Eleanor's mounting fears regarding the increasingly dangerous nature of their continued fight against Ashby's influence and power. The message from Alistair revealed that Ashby had begun leveraging old financial ties, connecting his own family estate to Alistair's household, debts incurred generations earlier that had long remained a quiet, uncomfortable arrangement between the two families. Ashby now threatened to call in these debts publicly, potentially damaging Alistair's reputation and financial standing unless he withdrew his support from the investigation and abandoned his protection of Eleanor entirely. Eleanor read the letter with growing horror, understanding immediately the impossible position this placed Alistair within. "He is trying to force you to choose between your own family's standing and my safety," she said, looking up at Margaret with evident distress. "I cannot allow him to sacrifice everything for my sake." Margaret, though sympathetic to Eleanor's concern, offered a measured perspective. "His Grace has made his choice clear throughout these past weeks. I do not believe threats of this nature will easily sway his resolve, particularly given what you have both already sacrificed to reach this point." Despite Margaret's reassurance, Eleanor could not shake the guilt building within her, the realization that her fight for justice had placed Alistair's entire family legacy at risk. She spent the remainder of the evening composing a letter of her own, expressing her concerns and offering to end their partnership if it meant protecting Alistair from further danger. The following day, before her letter could be delivered, Alistair himself arrived at the coastal residence, his expression carrying a mixture of exhaustion and unwavering determination. Eleanor rushed to meet him, the letter she had written now feeling insufficient compared to the conversation she knew they needed to have directly. "You should not have come," she said immediately. "Ashby is watching your every move now. Coming here only confirms your continued involvement." "I could not simply abandon you based on threats alone," Alistair replied firmly, taking a seat within the cottage's modest sitting room. "Ashby believes he can intimidate me into compliance by threatening old family debts. He underestimates my resolve considerably." "But what of your family's reputation, your financial standing?" Eleanor pressed, genuine concern evident in her voice. "I cannot allow you to sacrifice everything you have built simply to protect me." Alistair met her gaze steadily, his expression softening despite the seriousness of their conversation. "Eleanor, this fight ceased to be simply about protecting you weeks ago. It has become a matter of principle, of refusing to allow a man like Ashby to continue exploiting vulnerable families through fear and manipulation. Whatever risks this poses to my own standing, I consider them worth taking." His conviction moved Eleanor deeply, though the guilt of potentially costing him everything continued to weigh upon her conscience. There must be some way to address his threats without sacrificing your own security. "Nathaniel is already investigating the validity of these old debts he claims to hold against my family," Alistair explained. "Preliminary findings suggest the agreements may be similarly predatory in nature to those he imposed upon your own father, structured deliberately to grow beyond reasonable repayment. If this proves accurate, Ashby's threats may hold considerably less weight than he currently believes." This revelation offered Eleanor a measure of relief, though the underlying danger of their situation remained ever present. Even if his claims against your family prove invalid, he will not simply abandon his efforts against us. A man like Ashby does not accept defeat easily. "No," Alistair agreed, "which is precisely why we must move forward with the investigation as quickly and thoroughly as possible. The Whitfield family has agreed to provide formal testimony next week, and Nathaniel believes we have gathered sufficient evidence to proceed with formal charges shortly thereafter." The prospect of finally moving toward formal legal action against Ashby offered Eleanor a renewed sense of hope, tempered by the understanding that the coming weeks would likely prove among the most dangerous of their entire ordeal. "What can I do to help ensure this proceeds successfully?" Alistair considered the question carefully before responding. "Your own testimony will be crucial, Eleanor. Once formal charges are brought against Ashby, you will need to appear before the magistrate to provide your account of the coercive circumstances surrounding the proposed marriage arrangement." The prospect of facing Ashby directly, even within the protective confines of a formal legal proceeding, filled Eleanor with renewed anxiety. Yet she also recognized the necessity of her participation if they hoped to secure genuine justice, not just for herself, but for the other families harmed by Ashby's predatory practices. "I will testify," she said firmly, despite the fear evident in her voice, "whatever it takes to ensure he faces consequences for what he has done." Alistair reached across the space between them, taking her hand gently in his own, offering silent reassurance through the simple gesture. "You will not face this alone, Eleanor. I will be present throughout the entire proceeding, and Nathaniel will ensure proper protective measures are in place." Eleanor felt comforted by his presence, the warmth of his hand against hers, offering a sense of stability amid the mounting uncertainty surrounding their fight for justice. In this moment, surrounded by the quiet sound of waves breaking against the nearby cliffs, she found herself acknowledging fully the depth of feeling that had grown within her toward the man who had so unexpectedly become central to every aspect of her ongoing struggle. "Alistair," she said softly, "regardless of how this all concludes, I want you to know how deeply grateful I am for everything you have done. You did not have to help me that first night. You could have simply called out, had me removed from your carriage, and continued with your evening, as though nothing unusual had occurred." "I could have," Alistair acknowledged, "but something told me, even in that first moment of surprise, that turning you away would have been a grave mistake. I have not regretted my decision since, Eleanor, despite everything that has followed." Their eyes met, the growing connection between them, evident in the charged silence that settled over the room. Neither spoke further, though the unspoken understanding of deepening feelings hung palpably in the air between them. Eventually, practical matters reasserted themselves, and their conversation returned to the necessary preparations for the challenging days that lay ahead. Before departing once more, Alistair arranged for additional security measures to be implemented at the coastal residence, ensuring Eleanor would remain protected during the crucial period leading up to the formal proceedings against Ashby. As he prepared to leave, Eleanor accompanied him to the entrance, reluctant once again to see him depart, despite understanding the practical necessity of his continued absence. "Be careful," she said, echoing the same words she had offered during his previous departure. "Ashby has shown he is capable of considerable ruthlessness. I could not bear it if something happened to you because of your involvement in helping me." Alistair offered a reassuring smile, though the seriousness of their circumstances remained evident beneath his composed exterior. "I do not intend to allow Ashby's threats to deter me from seeing this fight through to its proper conclusion, Eleanor. We are close now to achieving genuine justice, both for you and for the other families he has harmed." As his carriage departed the coastal residence, disappearing into the distance along the cliffside road, Eleanor remained standing at the entrance, watching until he was no longer visible. The weight of everything that had transpired since that first desperate night settled heavily upon her, alongside a growing determination to see their fight through to its conclusion, regardless of whatever challenges Ashby continued to place before them. The sound of waves breaking against the cliffs below offered a constant, steady rhythm throughout the following days, a reminder of the natural world's persistence, despite the human conflicts unfolding within it. Eleanor spent this time preparing herself mentally and emotionally for the formal testimony that awaited her, understanding that the coming confrontation with Ashby would likely prove the most difficult challenge she had yet faced throughout this entire ordeal. The day of formal testimony arrived with a heavy gray sky, clouds gathering ominously over the countryside, as Eleanor prepared to face Ashby, for the first time since her desperate flight from her family home. Alistair arrived at the coastal residence early that morning, accompanied by Nathaniel, both prepared to offer whatever support Eleanor required, as she readied herself for the difficult proceedings ahead. "You do not have to face this alone," Alistair reminded her, as they traveled together toward the magistrate's residence, where the formal hearing would take place. "Whatever happens today, I will remain by your side throughout." Eleanor nodded, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap, the anticipation of confronting Ashby, directly stirring anxieties she had worked hard to manage in the days leading up to this moment. "I keep reminding myself why this matters, not just for my own future, but for the Whitfield family and others who have suffered because of his cruelty." Nathaniel, seated across from them, offered words of reassurance, drawn from his considerable experience with formal legal proceedings. "Magistrate Bellamy is known for his fairness, Miss Vance. He will not permit intimidation tactics within his courtroom, regardless of Ashby's standing or influence." Despite this reassurance, Eleanor could not fully quiet the anxiety building within her as their carriage approached the magistrate's residence. Through the window, she caught sight of several other carriages already arrived, including one bearing markings she immediately recognized as belonging to Ashby's household. Her breath caught momentarily, the physical proximity of her adversary after weeks of hiding sending a fresh wave of fear through her body. "Stay close to me," Alistair said quietly, sensing her rising anxiety. "We will face this together." As they entered the residence, Eleanor's eyes immediately found Ashby, seated with practiced composure among a small group of associates near the front of the assembled gathering. He appeared exactly as she remembered, tall and imposing, with a carefully cultivated air of aristocratic authority that had once intimidated her into near silence. Now, however, standing beside Alistair with weeks of growing courage behind her, Eleanor found herself meeting his gaze directly, refusing to allow the old fear to overwhelm her resolve. Ashby's expression shifted subtly upon recognizing her, surprise quickly masked by a calculated smile that did nothing to hide the underlying anger evident in his eyes. He offered a slight nod toward Alistair, acknowledging their presence with a formality that barely concealed the tension simmering beneath the surface of their interaction. Magistrate Bellamy called the proceedings to order shortly thereafter, and the formal hearing began, with Nathaniel presenting the accumulated evidence regarding Ashby's predatory lending practices. The documentation detailing the deliberately excessive interest rates applied to Eleanor's father's original debt was laid out methodically, followed by similar evidence gathered regarding the Whitfield family's circumstances. Ashby's legal representative attempted to challenge the validity of this evidence, arguing that such lending arrangements, however unfavorable, remained within the bounds of legally acceptable practice among the aristocracy. Bellamy listened carefully to these arguments before turning his attention toward Eleanor, requesting her formal testimony regarding the circumstances surrounding the proposed marriage arrangement. Eleanor rose from her seat, her heart pounding despite the outward calm she worked diligently to maintain. She recounted the events following her father's passing, the pressure applied by Ashby upon her grieving mother, and the coercive nature of the marriage arrangement that had ultimately driven her to flee rather than accept a future she had never chosen for herself. Throughout her testimony, Ashby's expression remained carefully controlled, though Eleanor noticed the tightening of his jaw whenever her account directly contradicted the narrative his representative had attempted to establish. When she finished speaking, Bellamy turned toward Ashby, offering him the opportunity to respond directly to the accusations presented against him. These accusations mischaracterize what was, in truth, a generous offer extended during a difficult period for the Vance family, Ashby said, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to manipulating perceptions in his favor. I sought only to help settle their financial difficulties through an honorable arrangement, one that Miss Vance's own mother willingly accepted on behalf of their family. And the excessive interest rates applied to the original loan? Bellamy asked pointedly. How do you explain terms that, by any reasonable measure, made repayment through conventional means nearly impossible? Ashby hesitated only briefly before responding, though the slight falter did not escape the attention of those observing closely. Financial arrangements of this nature often carry higher risk premiums, given the uncertain circumstances of the borrowing party. I fail to see how standard business practice constitutes the predatory scheme suggested by these baseless accusations. The exchange continued for some time, Bellamy pressing Ashby with increasingly pointed questions regarding the pattern of similar arrangements identified among other families, including the tragic circumstances surrounding the Whitfield family's daughter. Ashby's composure began to show visible strain as the mounting evidence painted an increasingly damning picture of calculated, systematic exploitation. As the proceedings continued into the afternoon, a representative from the Whitfield family arrived to provide their own formal testimony, corroborating the pattern of predatory lending and coercive marriage arrangements that mirrored Eleanor's own experience precisely. The weight of accumulated evidence, combined with consistent testimony from multiple affected families, began to visibly undermine Ashby's carefully constructed defense. By the time the day's proceedings concluded, Magistrate Bellamy announced his decision to formally proceed with charges against Ashby, citing sufficient evidence of predatory financial practices and coercive behavior warranting further legal action. Additionally, he ordered a temporary injunction preventing Ashby from pursuing any further claims against Eleanor or her family's estate while the formal investigation continued. As the gathering began to disperse following this announcement, Ashby approached Alistair directly, his expression carrying barely concealed fury despite his attempt to maintain aristocratic composure. You have made a significant error, interfering in matters that do not concern you, Your Grace. I will not forget this interference easily. I believe justice concerns everyone, Lord Ashby, Alistair replied evenly, refusing to be intimidated by the thinly veiled threat. Your practices have harmed too many families for too long. I do not regret my involvement in bringing this matter to proper attention. Ashby's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting briefly toward Eleanor, before returning to Alistair with renewed intensity. This is far from finished. You will both come to regret challenging me so publicly. Without waiting for a response, Ashby turned and departed the residence, his associates following closely behind him. Eleanor watched him leave, a complex mixture of relief and continued apprehension settling over her despite the significant victory achieved through the day's proceedings. He will not accept this defeat easily, she said quietly, as they prepared to depart themselves. No, Alistair agreed, but we have made significant progress today. The formal charges, combined with the injunction protecting you from further claims, represent genuine steps toward securing your safety and freedom. As their carriage carried them away from the magistrate's residence, Eleanor felt an overwhelming sense of relief, mixed with lingering anxiety regarding Ashby's implied threats. The day had brought significant progress in their fight for justice, yet she understood, based on everything she had learned about Ashby's character throughout this ordeal, that he would not simply accept this setback without attempting some form of retaliation. "What do you believe he will attempt next?" she asked, voicing the concern weighing heavily upon her thoughts. Alistair considered the question carefully before responding. "I do not know precisely, but we must remain vigilant. Nathaniel will continue building our case in preparation for the formal trial, while I will ensure your continued protection throughout this process." Despite the uncertainty that remained regarding Ashby's future actions, Eleanor found herself drawing strength from the significant progress achieved through the day's proceedings. For the first time since fleeing her family home, weeks earlier, she allowed herself to genuinely believe that justice might ultimately prevail, however difficult the remaining path toward that resolution might prove to be. As evening settled over the countryside, casting long shadows across the road as their carriage continued its journey, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how far she had traveled, both literally and emotionally, since that first desperate night of hiding beneath Alistair's carriage seat. The frightened young woman, who had begged a stranger to pretend she was his wife, had grown considerably throughout the weeks that followed, finding within herself a strength and resolve she had never fully recognized before circumstances forced her to discover it. In the days following the formal hearing, an uneasy calm settled over Eleanor's circumstances, though neither she nor Alistair believed this quiet would last indefinitely, given Ashby's clear determination to seek retaliation for the setback he had suffered. Nathaniel continued gathering additional evidence in preparation for the upcoming trial, while Alistair arranged for Eleanor to remain at Willowmere once more, the property having proven relatively secure during her earlier stay there. Word soon reached them that Ashby had begun making inquiries among his own connections within the legal system, attempting to identify any weaknesses in the case being built against him. Additionally, reports suggested he had approached several of the families who had provided testimony, attempting through various means to pressure them into recanting their statements or withdrawing their cooperation with the investigation. "He is growing desperate," Nathaniel observed during one of his regular visits to update Alistair and Eleanor on the case's progress. "This desperation may work in our favor, as it often leads men like Ashby to make mistakes that further expose their guilt." Despite this reassurance, Eleanor could not fully shake her concern regarding the safety of the Whitfield family and others who had risked significant danger by coming forward with their testimony. "We must ensure their protection remains a priority," she insisted. "They have shown remarkable courage in supporting this case, and we cannot allow Ashby's intimidation tactics to undermine their sacrifice." Alistair nodded in agreement, already having taken steps to ensure additional security measures were in place for all families involved in the case against Ashby. "Nathaniel has arranged for discreet protection for each family, though we must remain vigilant given Ashby's evident willingness to pursue aggressive tactics." As the weeks progressed toward the scheduled trial date, tension continued building steadily, each new report of Ashby's attempts to undermine their case, adding to the underlying anxiety that permeated their preparations. Yet alongside this tension, Eleanor found herself increasingly aware of the deepening connection between herself and Alistair, a bond forged through shared adversity that had evolved into something far more profound than either had initially anticipated. During one particularly difficult evening, as reports arrived detailing Ashby's latest attempt to intimidate a witness into silence, Eleanor found herself overwhelmed by the accumulated stress of their prolonged fight for justice. Alistair, noticing her evident distress, moved to comfort her, taking a seat beside her within Willowmere's familiar sitting room. "We are close now, Eleanor," he said gently, taking her hand within his own. "Whatever Ashby attempts in these final days before the trial, we have built a case strong enough to withstand his desperate tactics." "I know," Eleanor replied, though exhaustion was evident in her voice. "It is simply difficult, continuing to live under this constant shadow of fear, even as we approach what should be genuine resolution." Alistair studied her carefully, recognizing the toll these weeks of hiding and uncertainty had taken upon her emotional well-being. You have shown remarkable strength throughout this entire ordeal, Eleanor. Whatever happens moving forward, I want you to know how deeply I admire the courage you have demonstrated." His words, combined with the warmth of his hand still holding hers, brought a flush of emotion to Eleanor's expression. The growing feelings she had worked to manage throughout their shared struggle now becoming increasingly difficult to contain. "Alistair," she said softly, "I do not know how I will ever properly thank you for everything you have sacrificed on my behalf." "You need not thank me further," Alistair replied, his own emotions evident in the sincerity of his tone. "Being able to help you, to fight alongside you for justice, has meant more to me than you likely realize." The charged silence that followed carried an unspoken acknowledgement of the deepening bond between them, neither quite ready to fully articulate the depth of feeling that had grown throughout their shared trials. Yet the understanding remained present, a quiet promise of something more meaningful, waiting to be fully recognized, once the immediate dangers surrounding their circumstances had finally been resolved. As the trial date approached, final preparations intensified, with Nathaniel working tirelessly to ensure every aspect of their case remained airtight against whatever defense Ashby's legal representatives intended to mount. Additional witnesses came forward, as word of the investigation spread quietly among those who had suffered similarly under Ashby's predatory practices, strengthening the overall case considerably beyond what they had initially anticipated achieving. On the eve of the trial, Alistair visited Eleanor at Willowmere one final time before the proceedings that would determine the ultimate outcome of their long fight for justice. The weight of anticipation hung heavily between them as they discussed the final preparations, both understanding that the coming days would prove decisive in shaping their futures, individually and potentially together. "Are you prepared for tomorrow?" Alistair asked, though his tone carried more than simple practical concern. "As prepared as I can be," Eleanor replied honestly. "Whatever happens, I know we have done everything possible to build a strong case against him. I trust in the justice of our cause, even if I remain uncertain how the formal proceedings will ultimately unfold." Alistair nodded, sharing her cautious optimism tempered by the understanding that legal proceedings, particularly those involving powerful adversaries like Ashby, rarely proceeded without unexpected complications. "Regardless of tomorrow's outcome, Eleanor, I want you to know that these past weeks, despite their considerable challenges, have brought meaning into my life that I had not anticipated finding." His words carried an implicit acknowledgement of feelings neither had yet fully expressed, the growing connection between them now approaching a point where continued restraint felt increasingly difficult to maintain. Eleanor met his gaze, recognizing in his expression a reflection of her own deepening emotions throughout their shared journey. "I feel the same," she admitted softly. "Whatever fear and uncertainty has defined these past weeks, your presence throughout has offered something I did not expect to find amid such difficult circumstances." The moment held a quiet significance neither fully pursued further that evening, both recognizing the wisdom of allowing their emotions to develop naturally, rather than rushing toward conclusions before the immediate crisis surrounding Ashby's trial had been properly resolved. Yet the acknowledgement itself offered comfort, a promise of deeper connection, waiting to be explored once circumstances allowed. As Alistair prepared to depart Willowmere that evening, ensuring proper rest before the demanding proceedings awaiting them the following day, Eleanor found herself filled with a complex mixture of anticipation and lingering anxiety regarding what tomorrow would bring. The formal trial represented not just a critical juncture in their fight for justice against Ashby, but potentially a turning point in her own personal journey toward reclaiming the freedom and future that had been threatened since her father's passing. The night passed slowly, sleep proving elusive, as Eleanor's thoughts turned repeatedly toward the challenges awaiting her the following morning. Yet beneath the anxiety, a steady current of hope remained present, fortified by the unwavering support Alistair had provided throughout their shared ordeal, and the growing conviction that justice, however delayed, would ultimately prevail against the cruelty Ashby had inflicted upon so many innocent families. The morning of the trial arrived with clear skies, a welcome contrast to the gray clouds that had hung over the earlier hearing weeks before. Eleanor dressed carefully, aware that today's proceedings would prove far more significant than the initial gathering that had first brought formal charges against Ashby. Alistair arrived early to accompany her, his own composed exterior betraying little of the tension he undoubtedly felt regarding the day's critical importance. The courtroom, larger and more formal than the magistrate's private study where the earlier hearing had taken place, filled steadily with observers, as word of the case had spread throughout the surrounding communities. Several families who had suffered under Ashby's predatory practices attended in support, their presence offering Eleanor renewed strength as she prepared to face her adversary once more. Ashby arrived with his legal representatives, his expression carrying the same practiced composure Eleanor had witnessed during their previous encounter, though something beneath the surface suggested growing uncertainty regarding the strength of the case now arrayed against him. As the proceedings began, Magistrate Bellamy presided with the same measured fairness that had characterized the earlier hearing, allowing both sides to present their arguments thoroughly. Nathaniel presented the accumulated evidence methodically, building upon the foundation established during the initial hearing, with additional testimony gathered from several more families who had come forward following the earlier proceedings. The pattern of predatory lending, combined with coercive marriage arrangements designed to trap vulnerable families within inescapable circumstances, painted an increasingly damning picture of systematic exploitation spanning many years. Ashby's legal representatives attempted various defenses, questioning the validity of testimony from families who might harbor personal grievances against their client, and arguing that financial arrangements, however unfavorable, remained matters of private contract rather than criminal exploitation. Yet the sheer volume of consistent testimony, combined with detailed financial documentation demonstrating deliberate manipulation of interest rates and repayment terms, proved increasingly difficult to counter convincingly. When called to provide her own testimony once more, Eleanor spoke with a clarity and confidence that surprised even herself, recounting not just her own experience, but emphasizing the broader pattern of harm Ashby had inflicted upon multiple families through his calculated exploitation of grief and financial desperation. Her words carried weight beyond simple personal grievance, illuminating the systematic nature of the cruelty they sought to expose and end. As the day progressed, the Whitfield family provided additional testimony regarding the tragic circumstances surrounding their daughter's marriage and subsequent passing, details that had not been fully explored during the earlier hearing, now coming to light through careful questioning from Nathaniel. The emotional weight of this testimony visibly affected those present within the courtroom, further strengthening the overall case against Ashby's character and practices. By late afternoon, as the proceedings approached their conclusion, Magistrate Bellamy called for a brief recess before delivering his final judgment. During this pause, Ashby approached Alistair and Eleanor directly, his composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of mounting evidence against him. "You believe you have won something today," he said quietly, his voice carrying a bitter edge that had not been present during their earlier encounter. "But influence extends beyond a single courtroom, Your Grace. This matter is far from truly concluded." "Perhaps," Alistair replied evenly, refusing to be drawn into further confrontation. "But today, at least, the truth of your practices has been laid bare before those capable of rendering proper judgment. Whatever influence you believe you retain, it will not erase what has been revealed here." Ashby's expression darkened further, though he offered no additional response before turning away to rejoin his own legal representatives as the proceedings prepared to resume. Eleanor watched him retreat, a complex mixture of relief and lingering wariness reflected in her expression, despite the evident progress achieved throughout the day's testimony. When Magistrate Bellamy returned to deliver his final judgment, the courtroom fell into anticipatory silence, the weight of weeks of investigation and testimony culminating in this decisive moment. Bellamy addressed the assembled gathering with measured gravity, acknowledging the substantial evidence presented demonstrating a clear pattern of predatory financial practices, combined with coercive personal arrangements designed to exploit vulnerable families for personal gain. "Based on the evidence presented before this court," Bellamy announced, "I find sufficient grounds to rule against Lord Ashby regarding the predatory nature of the debt claimed against the Vance family estate. This debt, structured deliberately to prevent reasonable repayment, is hereby declared void, along with any claims of marriage arrangement predicated upon its fulfillment." A wave of relief swept through Eleanor at these words, the formal declaration finally severing the last legal connection binding her to the fate she had fled weeks earlier. Bellamy continued, addressing the broader pattern of harm demonstrated through testimony from multiple affected families. Furthermore, given the substantial evidence of similar predatory practices affecting other families within this region, I am ordering a comprehensive review of all financial arrangements conducted by Lord Ashby over the preceding decade, with appropriate compensation to be determined for those families demonstrably harmed by these deliberately exploitative practices. The judgment represented a significant victory, not just for Eleanor personally, but for all the families who had suffered under Ashby's calculated cruelty throughout the years. As the courtroom began to disperse following Bellamy's announcement, Eleanor found herself surrounded by grateful families, their gratitude for her courage in coming forward, mixing with relief that justice had finally been served against a man who had caused so much suffering. Ashby departed the courtroom in silence, his earlier composure completely abandoned as the reality of his defeat settled fully upon him. Whatever influence he had believed would protect him from consequence had proven insufficient against the weight of truth and justice finally brought to bear against his exploitative practices. As the crowd gradually thinned, Alistair found Eleanor standing near the courtroom entrance, tears of relief and vindication evident in her eyes as she processed the significance of what had just occurred. "It is finally over," she said softly, disbelief evident in her voice, despite the concrete reality of the judgment they had just witnessed. "Yes," Alistair confirmed, taking her hands gently within his own. "You are free now, Eleanor. Completely and legally free from the fate Ashby attempted to force upon you." The weight of weeks of fear and uncertainty finally lifted from Eleanor's shoulders, replaced by a profound sense of liberation she had scarcely allowed herself to imagine during the darkest moments of their prolonged struggle. As she looked up at Alistair, gratitude and something far deeper reflected clearly within her expression. She found herself finally ready to fully acknowledge the depth of feeling that had grown between them throughout this extraordinary journey. "I could never have achieved this without you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You risked everything, your reputation, your family's standing, simply to help a stranger who crawled beneath your carriage seat one desperate night." "You were never simply a stranger to me, Eleanor," Alistair replied, his own emotions evident in the sincerity of his tone. "From that very first night, something told me you were someone worth fighting for, worth protecting, regardless of whatever risks such a commitment might entail." As they stood together outside the courtroom, the setting sun casting warm golden light across the gathering crowd, Eleanor felt the final remnants of fear and uncertainty give way to genuine hope for the future that now lay open before her, a future no longer constrained by the desperate circumstances that had once defined her every waking moment. In the weeks following the trial, life gradually settled into a new and welcome rhythm for Eleanor. With Ashby's predatory claims formally dissolved and his reputation thoroughly exposed before the community that had once respected his standing, she found herself finally able to consider a future shaped by her own choices rather than circumstances forced upon her by others. She returned briefly to her family estate, reconciling with her mother, who had been deeply relieved to learn the truth behind Ashby's manipulative practices, and grateful beyond words that Eleanor had found the courage to resist an arrangement built upon such calculated cruelty. Their relationship, strained by grief and desperation in the months following her father's passing, began slowly healing as they navigated this new chapter together. Throughout this period of transition, Alistair remained a constant presence in Eleanor's life, their bond having grown far beyond the circumstances of necessity that had first brought them together. What had begun as a desperate plea, whispered within the confines of his carriage, had evolved into a genuine partnership built upon mutual respect, shared values, and a deepening affection that both had come to recognize as something far more significant than mere circumstance. One afternoon, several months after the trial's conclusion, Alistair invited Eleanor to Willowmere, the property that had first served as her refuge during those early, uncertain days of hiding. The manor house, once a temporary sanctuary from danger, now held different memories for both of them, associated instead with the growing connection that had developed throughout their shared ordeal. As they walked together through the gardens surrounding the estate, Eleanor noticed a nervousness in Alistair's demeanor that seemed unusual given the relative calm that had settled over their lives since Ashby's defeat. "Is something troubling you?" she asked, genuine concern evident in her voice. Alistair paused near a small fountain at the garden's center, turning to face her with an expression that combined evident affection with unmistakable nervousness. "Eleanor, these past months, since that extraordinary night you first hid within my carriage, have brought meaning into my life I had not anticipated finding. Your courage, your resilience, and the genuine connection we have built together throughout everything we faced has shown me what true partnership can mean." Eleanor felt her heart quicken, sensing the significance of what Alistair seemed prepared to share. "Alistair, I feel the same. These months, despite their considerable challenges, have brought me closer to you than I ever imagined possible when we first met under such frightening circumstances." Alistair reached into his coat, producing a small velvet box that he opened carefully to reveal a delicate ring, its simple elegance reflecting the genuine sincerity behind his intentions. "Eleanor Vance, that first night, you asked me to pretend you were my wife, simply to ensure your safety. Now, I find myself hoping you might consider making that pretense a genuine reality, not out of necessity or desperation, but because I have come to love you deeply and cannot imagine my future without you beside me." Tears of joy filled Eleanor's eyes as she absorbed the sincerity and depth of feeling behind Alistair's proposal. The journey that had begun with fear and desperate deception had transformed, through months of shared struggle and growing understanding, into something genuinely beautiful, a partnership built upon mutual respect, courage, and love that neither had anticipated finding when their paths first crossed on that rain-soaked evening. "Yes," she said softly, her voice filled with genuine emotion. "Alistair, yes, I would be honored to become your wife, not through pretense, but through genuine love and commitment." As Alistair slipped the ring onto her finger, both of them shared a smile that reflected the profound journey they had traveled together. From that first desperate night of hiding, to this moment of genuine joy and commitment. The gardens surrounding Willowmere, once merely a temporary refuge from danger, now held new significance as the setting for this pivotal moment in their shared future. Their wedding took place several months later, a joyful celebration attended by family, friends, and several of the families who had found justice through the courage Eleanor had shown in coming forward against Ashby's predatory practices. The ceremony, held within the same gardens where Alistair had proposed, carried a beautiful symmetry, transforming a place once associated with fear and uncertainty into a celebration of love triumphant over adversity. As Eleanor stood beside Alistair during their wedding vows, she found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a desperate plea within the confines of his carriage, a stranger's whispered request born from fear and necessity, had evolved into a genuine partnership built upon shared values, mutual courage, and a love that had grown organically through shared adversity and unwavering support. The Whitfield family attended the celebration, their presence a poignant reminder of the broader impact their fight for justice had achieved, extending far beyond Eleanor's personal circumstances into meaningful change for numerous families who had suffered under Ashby's cruel manipulation. Justice, though delayed, had ultimately prevailed, bringing not just personal freedom for Eleanor, but broader accountability for practices that had harmed so many innocent families throughout the years. As their wedding celebration continued into the evening, Eleanor found a quiet moment alone with Alistair, both reflecting on the extraordinary path that had led them to this joyful conclusion. "Do you remember what I said to you that first night?" she asked, a soft smile playing across her features. "Pretend I am your wife, and drive on," Alistair recited, the words having remained etched clearly within his memory throughout the months that followed that fateful encounter. "Now you truly are," Eleanor said softly, "not through pretense, but through genuine love and commitment, freely chosen by us both." Alistair drew her close, the warmth of genuine love reflected clearly in his expression as he looked upon the woman who had unexpectedly transformed his life through her courage and resilience. "The best decision I ever made was choosing to drive on that night, Eleanor, rather than turning you away. I do not intend to ever stop driving forward together, through whatever challenges our future may bring." As the stars emerged overhead, casting gentle light across the gardens where their journey together had truly begun to flourish, Eleanor and Alistair stood together, no longer bound by fear or desperate circumstance, but united through genuine love, unwavering courage, and a partnership forged through adversity that had ultimately led them toward a future filled with hope, justice, and enduring happiness neither had dared to imagine when their paths first crossed on that stormy, unforgettable night.